Wisdom and vision, we may not have these kinds of critical conversations that we need in order to make the changes within our state and our nation that we need, and within our own spaces that we need. So I won't take up a lot of space in this beginning because I'd like to pass it to Dr. Casperson to introduce our incredible panel and the way that our session will go this evening. But again, on behalf of everyone in the Center for Education, Equity, and Diversity, it's an honor to have you here in our space. And we welcome you and look forward to the rich and beautiful conversations that we have throughout the evening.
Let me just mention before we begin, we're videotaping this not only for our journal, we insert these things into our electronic journal, but we're also going to be televising it on our new TV program on TVW down in Olympia. So if you don't want to appear in the session, kind of find a way to sit behind the camera, unless you don't have any problems with it. Well, let me welcome all of you to our forum this evening. The forum is, we've been using these forums for the last 15 years, basically to try to encourage a public discussion of the really important issues in education. And nothing is more important than the topic that we're going to talk about this evening, the school-to-prison pipeline and the school-to-deportation pipeline. As a matter of fact, just last December, the United States Senate held its very first congressional hearing. It was a Judiciary Committee's subcommittee that held the first congressional hearing on the school-to-prison pipeline. And they wanted to focus on the excessive overuse of school discipline and on the large number of juvenile court referrals that are occurring. So this is a very timely topic, and we're very glad to be able to have a journal issue on it and also have a forum based on it. For those of you who are not aware of the Journal of Educational Controversy, we are an electronic journal, which allows us, again, to insert video right into our journal. And what we do is we often pose a controversial scenario where we ask authors to respond to that controversy. And this is the controversy that we posed for our authors in this journal. And by the way, you can see the issue right up here on the screen. We said the school-to-prison pipeline refers to a national trend in which school policies and practices are increasingly resulting in criminalizing students rather than educating them. Statistics indicate that the number of suspensions, expulsions, dropouts, and juvenile justice confinements is growing. Moreover, there is a disproportionate impact on students of color and students with disabilities and emotional problems. In this issue, we invite authors to examine the policy implications, the political ramifications, and the causes and possible solutions to the problem. Moreover, what are these policies teaching our children? And so we had authors from across the state and from across the nation responding to that question. And we tried to see if we could get some kind of illumination, some kind of enlightenment, some kind of understanding, deeper understanding of the problem. Before I introduce our panelists tonight, I do want to take just a moment to thank Christian French and the SEED staff. Raise your hand, SEED. Thank you so much for all the work you do with these forums. I really appreciate it. I want to also thank my editorial assistant, Selena Mesa, right here. Selena. And I'd like to also thank my co-editor, Dan Warner, who is a professor at Fairhaven College. He teaches courses in civil liberties as well as courses in the theater, and he has been a long-time board member of the ACLU. So thank you, Dan, for Now, as you'll notice, we have authors from all across the nation responding to this question. But we also have a special section on Washington State and the kinds of issues that come up in Washington, the laws, the policies, the problems that we in our state face. And so tonight we have a representation from Washington State, so you know what's going on in your own state. One of the speakers who's not here is Bobby Bridge, who is the former justice of the Washington State Supreme Court. And she wrote an article for us on behalf of her center, her new center called the Center for Children and Youth Justice. We do have, however, an interview that we did with Justice Bridge inserted in the journal. So you can, after you listen to our wonderful guest tonight, you can also listen to Justice Bridge talking about some of the problems as she sees it. Okay, so let me introduce then the panelists. You'll notice that in the program we have a rather extensive biography of our panelists. So I'm going to be brief here in introducing them, and then you can read up on their background yourself. First, I'd like to introduce at the end. We'll start with the end coming up. I'd like to introduce Dr. Thelma Jackson. Dr. Jackson is the founder and owner of Foresight Consultants in Olympia, and she has a very long history in leadership and education in Washington State, and has served on many important boards and commissions, and has received many awards and recognitions for her outstanding education and community service. She has worked under 5 different governors here in the state of Washington, and has worked on a number of commissions that gave rise to some of the legislation that the Washington State Legislature passed. Our next speaker will be Annie Lee. Annie Lee is the executive director of Team Child. Now, Team Child is a nonprofit civil legal advocacy group. They advocate for the legal rights of students, and they also provide legal representation for youngsters who run into problems with the schools and other state institutions. By the way, her article was also co-authored with Hillary Berman and Jeannie Nisk. Okay, next to Annie is, we have 2 actual representatives from the League of Education Voters. First, Maggie Wilkins is the state field coordinator of the League of Education Voters, and Tracy Sherman is the policy analyst at the League. Their article also was written by Heather Cope and Chris Korsma, along with Maggie Wilkins. And I'm going to skip over to John. I'll explain why. John Richardson is professor emeritus in sociology here at Western Washington University, and he is also the associate editor for the journal. I might just add that we have reviewed his most recent book called Comparing Special Education in not this issue but the last issue of the journal. Now, we wanted to expand on the topic to include not only the school-to-prison pipeline, but to include other pipelines, such as the school-to-deportation pipeline. And we were so fortunate to have our own Woodring colleague, Maria Timmons Flores, from the English department, elementary department, sorry, from the elementary department. Maria teaches courses in TESOL, bilingual and multicultural education, along with other courses in the elementary department, and she wants to help teachers understand the influence of language and culture on learning. And so her article talks about what teachers need to know and understand about children in their classrooms who are undocumented. And so thank you for expanding the vision of our issue. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to pose a problem or a question. And I'm going to give each of you 10, 15 minutes, whatever you need, 10 minutes probably, to respond to it in light of your own articles. We know the statistics. We know the facts. As a matter of fact, just last March, the Seattle Times reported that the United States Department of Education is conducting an investigation of the Seattle public schools because they found what they said is some very troubling, some very stark statistics. This is now March 2013. For example, African American students are suspended from school more than 3 times as often as white students, all the way from elementary to high school. More than 1/4 of the black middle school students have received short-term suspensions every year since 1996. 1/4 are suspended every year since 1996. We know that there are 50,000 students in our state that are suspended and expelled every year. We know the dropout rate. We know the achievement gap. We have all of these statistics and information. The question is, what's the problem? Now, I wrote a recent op-ed piece for the Bellingham Herald, and some of the comments that were written on the Bellingham Herald's website were written by people who said, well, there's no problem. It's the kids' fault. They're acting up. They're being punished. And a lot of people didn't really understand the larger picture of what is happening here, what's going on here. And so I thought we might start by asking each of you, how did you define the problem? What was the question that you addressed in your paper? And what recommendations are you making as a result of the question you raised? The way you pose a problem determines where you look for a solution. The way you ask a question determines where you look for an answer. And so all of the writers in our issue posed a question that they wanted to respond to. And I thought we might begin by asking each of you to define that problem and your solution. And then we'll take it from there, and we want to get a lot of questions from the audience as well. So I'd like to go in the following order. Dr. Thelma Jackson, I'd like to ask you to go first. Thelma wrote an article for an earlier issue, the winter 2007 issue, which covers the same issues that we're raising tonight about the achievement gap and the disproportionate treatment of students. And so she looks at it from a very broad perspective. And then we'll move right after you, Thelma, we'll move to Annie and all the way down. Skip Maria, go to John, who's going to raise questions about this whole metaphor that we're using called the school-to-prison pipeline, and questions whether or not, what does this metaphor mean? And then we'll go into the deportation issues, and then we'll open it also to the audience. So thank you again. Please join me in thanking our panel for joining us. Dr. Jackson?
Well, you raised quite a daunting question because this whole issue is so large, it's so comprehensive, and it has many tentacles to it. So when we talk about the school-to-prison pipeline, we're talking about somewhat of a new term that's popped up, last 5-6 years ago. When I wrote the article for the journal in '07, I talked about the malpractice in education and what's happening with the education of African American students and other disenfranchised children in the system. I touched briefly on the whole issue of disproportionality in discipline, a lot of the inequities, the lack of opportunity, the lack of access. And so the topic that's evolved and has come around, looking specifically at the school-to-prison pipeline, I became involved in that whole issue in looking at the achievement gap and in unpacking the achievement gap, looking for the contributing factors to the gap, and not just focusing on test scores and assessment data, but what is going on here. As a researcher, that's the question I ask myself. What is really going on here? And what is going on is nothing new. It's been going on for quite some time. But we've begun to put a face on it, and we've begun to put a name or a topic to it. And so when you talk about the Department of Education being in the Seattle schools, exposing some very troubling data, that data is not new. The Department of Education could visit a number of school districts in the state of Washington, and that data would be very similar. So if it's not new and it's nothing different, many people by surprise. Why are so many people appalled at what this data tells us? Well, as I've spent years looking at the achievement gap and disaggregating that data, the same students that are caught in the achievement gap are the same students that are being disproportionately disciplined, are the same students that are being incarcerated later, and so forth and so on. So how can it be that it's taken us so long to begin to connect some of these dots so that the real picture can come into focus as to what is really going on in public education? And why do we have so many of our children being negatively impacted by their school process? And so as I write about the educational malpractice, I talk about the fact that because education never was intended for all children, and we've been working very hard trying to drive a square peg into this round hole, tinkering around the edges, but not fundamentally reforming education, what we do and how we do it. And so with all of the various assessment kinds of activities that have been going on, and as we begin to disaggregate it, we can easily see who are the groups of children who have been traditionally and historically left behind. And it took the No Child Left Behind Act to really frame the issue for school districts to have to disaggregate their data. The data was there all the time, but to disaggregate it by those 32 cells that the federal government required them to do, then all of a sudden we had a problem. All of a sudden children of color were not meeting standard. All of a sudden poor children were not meeting standard. Non-English speaking children were not meeting standard. Disabled children were not meeting standard, and so forth and so on. It was nothing new. And with all of the warts and the bumps of the No Child Left Behind law, that was one of the positives. It forced school districts to have to disaggregate that data and come face to face with their failure with so many groups of children. And now as we relate all of that to the disproportionate discipline phenomenon, and we find that schools have been complicit in providing the raw material that feed this track, this wavelength, this pipeline to a life of incarceration. We look at the dropout rates. We look at the graduation rates. We look at unemployment. We look at who has no access and opportunity to what class as far as gifted, advanced placement. There is so much that verifies things from one point to the next. And I termed it as educational malpractice. We talk about legal malpractice and medical malpractice. Well, I thought it was time we talked about educational malpractice, because we have far too much of it going on. We have far too much energy that goes into maintenance of the status quo as opposed to authentic reform, such that we can change this system that's been in place for over 200, 250 years, a system that never was intended to educate the diverse populations of students that occupy our classrooms today. And so we tinker around the edge and we call it reform. But very little is fundamentally different. And so we see the fallout. We see the manifestations of a lot of the practices, behaviors, policies, decisions that have been made. It's not just about more money. It's also about fundamentally thinking differently about what our schools need to look like, what outcomes we need for them, and the things we need to do differently. If in fact we say we want all of our students, and everyone, tosses that phrase out very, very loosely, all of our students to be career and work ready when they leave our schools. And far too many of our students are anywhere near career and work ready. So the reforms have not worked. They have not gotten traction. They have not taken hold. But the trends we do see are pointing things in the wrong direction. So the more we can bring a focus on this issue, the more people can talk about it, the more people write about it, the more awareness we can raise, and the more consciousness levels that are part of this courageous conversation, maybe we can begin to get around to changing this trend and changing the way things are going. But that's what somewhat drives me as an educational advocate, and the connections and the dots I've been able to connect. So I can't talk about closing the achievement gap without talking about these other things that are contributing factors to it.
Would you like me to just dive in? Hi, thank you all. Thanks for the invitation to be here tonight. Again, my name is Annie Lee, and I was thinking about this day and all of you being here listening to this talk, and thinking about the connection that you all have to education, and how, if you reflect back on what had to happen for you to get to this place today, who helped you along the way, what opportunities you had or didn't have, when you ran into a bump in the road, what sorts of things helped you get over the bump and move on. I think that all of those things are things that are missing for many of the youth that we work with at our office at Team Child. And I just want to remind you about the things that we all had to get to this place, and sort of consider what structural things got in the way or are getting in the way for the youth that are winding up in the justice system and out of school or not without an education. So to get to the solution or the problem statement that was posed to the panel, I'd like to give you just a little perspective about our organization. So our office is pretty unique in the world of free legal services around the country. We specialize in areas of law that are related to what young people, teenagers, might be experiencing in their lives. So our work is really focused on access to education, access to health care, access to safe and stable housing, access to all of those sort of basic support needs that young people might need to be successful and make it successfully through adolescence into adulthood. Now, our work is, and our attorneys sit at sort of the confluence of where the multiple challenges and systems are feeding into the justice system. So our clients have experienced abuse and neglect. They may be involved in the child welfare, may have been involved in the child welfare system, or should be involved in the child welfare system. They are challenged by disability, extreme poverty, school problems, substance abuse, health issues, pervasive health issues in the community. So the clients that we work with are, we're sitting at a point where they are starting to enter and bump up against and get sucked into the justice system. And all of these factors have contributed to where they are and why they have such a difficult time getting out. We were started as a pilot project in collaboration with public defenders who were working with young people and seeing them experience, have behavior that brought them into the justice system, but then they'd be held accountable and they'd return to the community, and nothing would have changed in the community. They'd be out of school, they wouldn't have a safe and stable place to live, they'd have all these other problems. And so the idea of Team Child was really born out of this problem of the justice system being really very inadequate to address the real underlying needs, the root causes of why kids were getting involved in it and then staying in the justice system. So we started in 1995, so over the last almost 20 years now, we've seen thousands of teenagers. And the biggest presenting problem that everybody struggled with was education. So, and the reason why it seemed to be the biggest presenting problem is it's because as a teenager, that's what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be in school every day. And so it's so striking that when we see clients who have had behavioral issues that resulted in criminal involvement, that one of the common missing pieces was successful school experiences. And in our advocacy on behalf of individual clients, we have been representing them in their challenges getting back into school, representing them in trying to set up school programs that are better suited to meet their very, very wide-ranging needs. Many of the clients that we serve have underlying disabilities. Many of them are dealing with trauma in their lives that don't necessarily get identified as disability, but impact them so greatly in their ability to learn, their ability to adapt, and their ability to cope with really stressful situations. So these are common denominators that our clients experience, and it's it's sort of the perspective that we bring to this conversation. We see this. I think over the last almost 20 years, we've probably seen 10,000 cases of kids just out of school, flat out of school, and their path back in is so difficult. And I think one of the other striking aspects about the work that we do is that oftentimes these children and youth are trying to do this on their own or with community and family that are really don't have the resources, the political capital to really get the leverage to get back into school. So that's sort of the perspective that we have. Our article focused on an aspect about this conversation that I think is not often discussed: the entanglement that young people have with school failure and juvenile justice involvement. So many of the discussions across the country are rightly in a place that talks about the causal, sort of the sequencing of extreme policies that criminalize behavior that result in young people getting into the justice system. There's conversations about the use of police in schools and how having the presence of law enforcement sort of raises the stakes when you have a fight on the playground or you are disobedient and defiant with a teacher. And so if you have a school resource officer or a law enforcement on campus, some of those behaviors that may have been dealt with historically by the school principal with a conversation with your parents are getting dealt with by the law enforcement that responds in a way that is a real direct link to the justice system. So those things are really well documented. One of the things that we felt we could bring or add value in terms of the conversation is to talk about this entanglement, about how the however you get into the justice system, the sort of difficulties of getting back on track in school are so intertwined with justice involvement. You know, if you, in our article, we talked about a young person who, you know, got involved in justice system because of shoplifting, right? And then wound up staying involved, and then when he got out, couldn't get back, fell so far behind in school that sort of the motivation to get on track, the ability to really do well in school was impaired by the justice involvement. So there's sort of a two-way, multiple kind of intersection between justice involvement and school challenges. And I think the perspective that we bring is that we need to deal with all aspects about this problem. We can't just deal with solutions need to come through really understanding how the systems work together and feed each other, and ultimately keep kids from coming back without a whole lot of barriers to overcome, additional barriers to overcome than the ones that they probably already started with, given sort of the cards that are dealt to them as young children. The other couple areas we talked about, in addition to sort of this, sort of if you're already in the system, it's difficult to kind of not get deeper in a hole with academic failure or challenges. We talked about the problem of young people returning and trying to get back into school is a really big issue that we deal with often, and that presents, you know, ongoing challenges. So I noticed walking in this room that there's a Michelle Alexander's book is there, and I think you know, her discussion about race and mass incarceration is part of the end of the story for many of these kids. That it's oftentimes impossible to change anything without changing the frame that we're sort of placing these issues in. Another area we talk about in the article is the criminalization of disability related behaviors. And if you look at statistics in the juvenile justice system, you'll see that many children with disabilities, a higher ratio of children with disabilities, are involved in the justice system. Now, the justice system is very ill-equipped to deal with that. It's not a mental health provider. It's not able to understand trauma very well and deal with trauma. In fact, a lot of the things that we do in the justice system add to the trauma that young people have already experienced in their lives. But yet we still don't have a better system. Now, on the other hand, we have incredible civil rights for children with disabilities in our schools. And those civil rights are underutilized in many instances, especially as behaviors start to present as troubling, as unsafe. There's sort of this imbalance that happens, especially as young people get older. So when the justice system starts to take over, the school, and where you have more resources and more expertise, sort of lets go. And as the justice system takes over, the pull of the justice system is so much greater than the ability of schools to retain and serve well kids. So that's another area where we've identified a pressure point in this relationship between school and juvenile justice. And as we identify pressure points, I think we find solutions there. So that's another area. The other area. The last area I'll just refer to in our article, and there are many more, and we just tried to limit it to a few so that we wouldn't bore everyone. But the other area is something that we've been working on this year pretty intensively, and that is that in Washington State, I don't know if many of you know that we have a system of excluding young people that doesn't help them know when they go back to school. So we have expulsions here in Washington State as well as emergency expulsions. Those are by definition in our state regulations without any end. So as a student, if I get expelled from school, or maybe it oftentimes starts out with an emergency expulsion, I get out of school, I don't know when I'm supposed to be back. The school doesn't give me an end date. And there's no process really defined uniformly across the state about how you go about doing that. So in our experience at Team Child, we see children that have been out of school for weeks, months, years, and they have no idea how to get back. The other aspect about this that is sort of one of those disconnects that you just wonder why it exists is that there's a separate kind of rule in our state that says to school districts, if a student stops attending for 20 days, then unenroll them, right? So you have this phenomenon where schools are perceiving behavior that requires an expulsion, so open-ended, undefined exclusion. And they're also asked by the state to stop counting them, to actively unenroll. So we've sort of got this perfect storm of and this is a frame, right, that all of this is happening and that we could change. So we bring this up because this indefinite nature of exclusions is so extreme, especially for families that don't have a lot of ability to and a lot of, again, political capital, reconnect themselves to sort of mainstream schooling. And if you're labeled and stigmatized by your behavior, it's even harder to recover from sort of this open-ended exclusion. So that's the last area. And again, I'll pass it on to Maggie, but I can talk much more about solutions as we get on. But that's how we frame the problem.
Thanks, Annie. So I'm Maggie. I'm the state field coordinator at League of Education Voters. We are a statewide advocacy group, and we work on public school policy. And a lot of times that takes a little bit of explaining about what you actually do. How do you advocate for policy changes? And so I find myself talking a lot about our organizational theory of change and my own personal theory of change. And I brought a handout today. You can get up on the front table, but I'm a sociologist, and so I started my education and my work really looking at systems and structures, and so you pose the question, what is the issue we're getting at? And much like Thelma, I started kind of looking at the achievement gap and realized pretty quickly that as a society we don't know or understand structural racism. If you're looking at this diagram here, we've got clusters of individuals working together. They make communities, and when communities band together, we create large institutions. And so for many folks, it's understandable, and they can relate what interpersonal racism looks like and what individual bias and prejudice is. And then when you move to neighborhoods and cultures and communities, we can understand how some areas feel more hostile for some people than others. That type of bias and racism makes sense too. When we get to structural racism and institutional racism, it's all of a sudden pretty intangible for folks. And so talking with, my job as a community organizer really, if you've ever sat around with a group of friends and thought, man, that's a huge problem, somebody should really do something about it, that's what I do as a community organizer. I'm that person that jumps in and kind of picks up the pieces and organizes other folks to get engaged and involved. And so when we are talking about structural racism and achievement gap and school-to-prison pipeline, my role in that is, we can look at change from all these different levels, but as an advocacy group, we focus a lot on state policy and state practice. We look a lot too at school district policies and working with school boards and superintendents. We do less work in individual schools and communities and even less work in smaller classrooms. So that's a little bit about why and how we do the work that we're doing on this issue. For the past 6 months or so, we've been fairly focused on working with the Seattle School District and to try to help position the superintendent and the school board to meaningfully address this investigation by the federal government. And so through some of this local school work that we've been doing, we've identified some best practices for how school districts and classrooms are starting to address the school-to-prison pipeline. And so we are taking a look and a focus on institutional policies because these have a direct impact on our classrooms. And when our classrooms start to change and morph, it forces the adults and the administrators in the building to change their personal feelings as well, which has a direct impact on individual students. And so I wanted to also share what some of the best practices are around transforming school discipline at the school level. And so we know that effective discipline practices, they transform not just academic outcomes for students, they don't just keep more kids in school, but they actually shift and alter the cultures of the classroom. And they, again, alter adults communicate and have relationships with young people. And we know that best practices across the nation, they're somewhat rooted in research. A lot of these changes are new to this nation, I guess, or talking about the issue openly is new. Even 4 years ago, I found that there are very few people in Washington that could articulate and explain what the actual achievement gap was. And so we've seen a huge shift even in the last couple of years around this issue, which is hopeful for me. And so it's a new emerging issue that people are now starting to address at a societal level. And so when we say rooted in research, we don't necessarily mean that it's been tried and true and it's worked in schools for the past 30 years, because nothing has worked really for the past 30 years in our education system, and Thelma did a great job articulating that. We know that effective school practices actually utilize current resources in the district. So we don't have to reinvent any wheels here. We know that there are pockets of money for professional development. We know that principals have the authority and autonomy to select alternative discipline programs at their schools. We know that there's money for these kinds of reforms and changes. So we don't have to launch a giant initiative and raise a ton of money. It's there. We just need to smartly maneuver our budgets. We also know that best practices are specific to schools, they're specific to districts, they address the specific needs of the student population that's most affected by disproportionality and discipline. There's not going to be one cure-all or one silver bullet. And I think it makes perfect sense that, a school in Tacoma, they're going to need different solutions than a school in rural Yakima. We also know that best practices, while it is terrifying for some folks, best practices utilize data, and effective school leaders will set benchmarks and set goals and then use data to track and analyze how their school is doing and improving. And a lot of the national rhetoric around education reform talks about data and accountability in a negative light. I feel like there are a lot of teachers that feel under attack in many ways because of these new accountability measures on teacher and principal evaluations in particular. But I actually think that data can be used in a positive light, and we don't often talk about it that way. But instead of focusing on how we're not serving students, we can actually start to use data to show how we're making improvements in our school buildings. Lastly, best practices, they alter written policies in schools. Again, there is cultural shifts in the way that adults interact with young people, but we want to make sure that gets written into policy. We recently had an event in Seattle that talked with several principals and practitioners, and also I call them consultants for alternative discipline programs. And what I realized very quickly is there were a lot of charismatic leaders sitting on the panel that had great relationships with their young people and did a really good job of building their team around positive solutions. But I was left wondering, well, what happens when that teacher or that principal goes to another school or another classroom? How do we ensure that the good positive changes we're making stay within that school building? And so effective practices are changing policies while they're also changing outcomes. Tracy's going to speak a little bit more about some of the statewide legislative work that we've done. And I just want to mention, too, that we've worked really closely with Thelma and Annie and Team Child over the past 8-9 months. So we're among friends up here.
Great. So I'm Tracy. I work at the League of Education Voters, and we're a statewide education advocacy organization. And we really work to improve education in Washington State from cradle to career. So that means everything from increasing funding for education to working on policy changes. And sort of why we really work on the issue, or sort of how we came to it, is really closing the achievement or opportunity gap. And really kind of common sense at the end of the day is the way I view it. If kids aren't in school, they aren't going to be learning, and they aren't going to do very well, and you drastically increase the likelihood of them dropping out. So we as an organization our goal would be every student in Washington State graduates high school ready for college or career. And we really view suspending and expelling students as a huge sort of problem to achieving that goal. So we address the issue a couple different ways. We work on policy, legislative changes, and then also sort of community organizing along the lines of what Maggie mentioned. So some of the problems with school discipline, I guess I'll say in Washington State, but more broadly probably the entire country, at least in Washington State, we actually have very few state laws on the issue. I was shocked when I first started researching it. Unlike even some neighboring states close by, we don't limit how long a student can be out of school, even if they're suspended. And that was sort of one of the things we learned when talking to legislators, were that people were shocked that a student could literally be out of school for 4 months, 5 months, I mean, who knows how long, and expelled for sort of forever if they couldn't get back into a school or school district. Another sort of thing that shocked people, and I might be preaching to the choir, but it was basically that you're guaranteed an education in the juvenile or criminal justice system, but you aren't if you're kicked out of school. So we really started pushing legislation this year. Because we don't have many state laws on the books, we view it as a multi-year effort. We really had a lot of educating to do of the state legislator. They cover, numerous different issues. So people just really didn't even know what was currently happening, what the current laws were, and then obviously what we would like to see change. So we really started with some basic legislation, I guess I would say common sense, but it's actually hard to get really transparent data on even how many students are suspended and expelled each year in Washington State. And then if you want to find out the racial breakdown or socioeconomic breakdown, it's even harder to get that data, and it's not sort of publicly available on a state website that a parent could easily go to and sort of find out what's happening at their school. So that was sort of the first part of our bill, was saying, hey, they're actually already collecting the data, but you have to make it publicly available in a at least somewhat user-friendly way. And then also putting a limit as to how long students can be out of school. Our legislation is still kind of moving through the process, so right now it's written that it would be no more than a year that a student could be out of school. And then also, Annie mentioned earlier, emergency expulsions. Basically, that a school would have to convert that to something else, whether it was a suspension, expulsion, or maybe the student was let back into school, but they would have to convert it to something else within 10 days. So an emergency expulsion couldn't kind of go on forever. And then the schools would also need to do re-entry meetings. So kind of oftentimes, especially if a student's been out of school for months, they can just sort of like show up at school and, it's sort of sink or swim in a way. So this would make it so that the schools really sort of, in a way, have to develop a plan of how they're going to reintegrate, even sort of make up missed coursework, that sort of thing, to hopefully not have them out of school again. And then we also work with local districts, like Maggie was mentioning. So that can be anything from working with maybe members in the community to actually working with them to change their school district policies surrounding discipline. A lot of people just sort of don't know what good policy is. I don't think the average person realizes how many kids are being kicked out of school. I know I was shocked to meet some straight-A students that had been kicked out for things that I wouldn't consider safety concerns. A lot of sort of misbehaving, defiance, things that I honestly think some of you in the audience are younger than others, but things that, I know kids my age did growing up, and it was more of, you're sent to the principal's office and got a talking to, or your parents were called, and that was the real punishment probably more than anything, but you weren't kicked out of school for it. So the punishments that students are receiving now are just drastically more than they were generations previous. So we really sort of look at the problem from a variety of angles, but definitely come to it from sort of the education perspective, and then attack it on sort of the state level and also the local level.
Oh, skip.
Yeah.
I'm heartened to hear that there's a fellow sociologist on the panel. I should probably start with what I did a doctoral dissertation on way back. I was a substitute teacher in Oakland, California. You might have heard of Oakland. It gets very good press at times. And I got called to be a substitute teacher in a special education class, which was in fact portable at the corner of the schoolyard. So I went to the portable and I sat in there and the bell rang and nobody showed up. Minutes go by, nobody showed up, and then finally some guy comes through the window, not the door, which is wide open. Another one came through the window, and then they finally kind of showed up. And it was a class for the educable mentally retarded. And what hit me when they finally all got there about 20 minutes after the hour, or between 10 and 20, is where in heaven's name this diagnosis, this label came from. Because if anything, they were very, very shrewd. They were not they were not mentally retarded, and so forth. They were one was a football hero, Marvin Jefferson, who referred to himself as Jarvin Mefferson. So, I mean, what does that mean? So I thought I had discovered at least a topic to do a dissertation on, that there was this seemingly misdiagnosis of black and Hispanic kids as mentally retarded, only to have my chair drop paper in front of me, which was by Jane Mercer, sociologist, who had frankly exposed what came to be called racial overrepresentation in special education. So after I stopped crying, because I thought, well, that's the end of my degree, I set out to interview teachers, and with the statistics in hand. And I went from, got a long list of teachers, and I was actually, I must confess, sort of convinced that I would detect signs of prejudice or racial discrimination or something like that. And so I kind of maneuvered my so-called questionnaire, interaction, toward what I probably was having in my own mind as sort of biases of expectation. The complete opposite happened, is that to a person, the teachers were, first of all, shocked at the statistics, which I was too when I first gathered them up. But they were also outstanding, well-educated, well-meaning, well-intentioned, worked 10 hours plus a day, it seemed, all positive indicators and all that, and but still stunned at the racial disparities in special education. So I ended up doing a doctoral dissertation, really an analysis of the California Education Code. I won't get into that, but I had to come up with something, because what vanished in front of me was the teachers were not the culprits, or the intentions, the attitudes, and all this other kind of stuff were not the culprits. That held its grip on my mind for a long time. The discrepancy between avowed attitudes or opinions and intentions and aggregate outcomes, statistical outcomes, which we've heard about. Then I got a job at a school called Western Washington University, and I was directed, not asked, to teach classical sociological theory, which sounded really good to me, and I ended up teaching it for a long, long time. And I finally used Emil Durkheim's Suicide. You might have heard of it, might have read it. And I said to the students, I said, well, now one of those books is a classic work by Durkheim, simply called Suicide. I said, what do you think it's about? What are the causes of suicide? And I was kind of devious there, the more I think about it. And depression, marital problems, financial problems, depression, financial problems, marital problems, and so forth. I said, oh, really? And then I pushed it a little further. I said, how do you know this? But got to a point where there was just silence, because I kept knocking down each kind of claim. And I said, oh, I just want to head you off here. If you, in fact, are going to read Suicide, my recommendation is that you start at the end of the book and work forward, and we'll work toward the front, because, well, I explained it. And I said, well, the essence of the book, if I'm going to do them some justice, is the discrepancy between aggregate rates, which are constant, and the intentions and the motivations and the reasons given and so forth. That there's absolutely sort of no connection. Let me go back to the first. The rates of suicide are constant. That doesn't mean they're absolutely the same, but if you plot them, it's just, there it is. Soon after that, when I said that, the day that I remember doing that, I read an article in the paper that the rate of highway deaths in Washington State are basically identical year to year to year. If you control for the population size, it's exactly the same number. I mean, not exactly, but stunningly the same. And you can't say that, well, you know, it's low, and so people, I got to get this rate up to what. Excited because it related to a personal experience of trying to come up with a dissertation topic. I've never left that as a intellectual passion. Is that sort of, if you want to know what sociology is about, in my opinion, well, it's several things, but at least it's let's study rates and the constancy of rates. Let's study the absence of change. Let's study the impenetrability of school structures and school behaviors. And let's study the cyclical patterns of reforms that we can predict will come about every 20 years and will fail. And the topic of school to prison struck me as a very, very timely candidate for sort of Durkheim's thesis, and another Bible of mine is Micromotives and Macro Behavior by Thomas Schelling. Is that aggregate patterns, structural patterns, are independent of individual intentions and motives. That just has to be said and said and said and said and said. So I think it's the evidence is very clear that that the statistics of racial disparities are not in any way connected to differential rates of misbehavior. I mean, Michelle helped me. Michelle Alexander's brilliant book. She says it so beautifully in the beginning. Is it's the sort of the rates of use of drugs is probably higher in whites. So it's not at the individual behavioral level that accounts for the race. It's as if each school has a racial disparity statistic. And somehow, like highway deaths in Washington State, by the end of the year, it's reached. But this kind of idea that we should look at the constancy of the racial disparity indicators or something like that over time. I bluntly would suggest would make sense to a biologist before it makes sense to those of us who are involved in education. They'd probably go, yeah, what took you guys so long? And then they'd come out with their Greek words about how evolutionary structures evolve and so forth and so on. But they're tuned into sort of the self-generating character of structures. Once they begin, they take on a life of their own, and it's as if they then rise to a point, a rate, which of course is a point at which forces below it keep it at this level, and forces above it are they're acting on that point. And so by the end of the year, the state highway death rate is stunningly, remarkably similar to the previous year and the previous year and the previous year. And the rate of racial disparities just is so intransigent, but it's not there because of prejudiced teachers, bad this and bad that. So the study that we did in the journal is, real quickly, is that my seemingly endless fascination with special education is that if we're going to take this word pipeline seriously, which can have bad effects because we start to look for, pipes or something, but that the racial disparities at the end of the pipeline are in some way connected to sequential steps inside schools. And some of the key steps inside schools are special education categories. They're almost better to be seen as steps than categories. And one of the things we found is that the rate of incarceration for looking at cross-state, it's a cross-state analysis, Alabama to Wyoming, none of this Hawaii and Alaska stuff. I have no idea what to do with those states because they're not contiguous. So if you look at the differential rates of incarceration, they are connected to specific special education categories. For Hispanics, it's learning disability, which we suggested is Spanish still is a problem instead of a merit. For blacks, it's mental retardation, the legacy of racial overrepresentation that was discovered in the 1960s and has not gone away, even with the national monitoring system. And for whites, it is emotionally disturbed. So once in those categories, the movement toward the outcome that we are interested in is set in motion, and it takes on a life of its own, and statistics remain remarkably intransigent.
Thank you, John.
So I'm Maria Timmons Flores, and I'm going to shift gears or extend the conversation a little bit. The title of the paper that I wrote was called The School-to-Deportation Pipeline, or actually is A Dream Deported, because the students that I'm going to talk about who are undocumented American youth, they certainly are subjected to many of the things that we've heard about here today, but the outcome for them is different. Instead of going to prison, they're deported. I framed the paper in critical race theory, which really says, more than anything else, that our institutions, our laws, practices, policies, are subjected to race and issues of oppression. So rather than the individuals we're talking about, it's not about the individuals, it's about how our system deals with them and where they end up because of that. My own personal history is I came into teacher education because I was working in the juvenile injustice system, as I called it, and I realized that almost to a one, every one of the young men, and they were young men at that time, almost to a one had some kind of identifiable learning difference. They were also largely Latino and African American. It wasn't that the white kids didn't commit crimes, it's just they didn't end up in the same places. And back then, it definitely was primarily men. We've changed that a great deal. There are many more young women who are in that system now. When I'm talking about undocumented American youth, they certainly have many of the same criteria, just as you mentioned. They definitely have many of the same factors, but it's even more complex for them. So one of the features of critical race theory is not only that embedded oppression and racism within our system, but it's also about the intersectionality of those aspects of difference that we talk about. So for the students that I'm talking about, they certainly, they come from all kinds of different ethnic and racial backgrounds, although they're predominantly Latino. The largest number of them are Latino. They also, many of them speak English as a second language, which is further complicated in our schools because it gets confused with differences in learning and learning disabilities and classifications that way. And they also, the probably defining feature for the students I'm talking about is their immigration status. Every year we graduate 65,000 students who are undocumented. There probably are that equal number of students who are undocumented who do not graduate from our U.S. high schools. Estimates are that there are about 1.8 million children in this country right now under the age of 18 who are undocumented. And what does that mean, undocumented? I assume I'm talking to an audience that has a sense, but it's important to note that these are children who were brought to this country by their families for all kinds of different reasons. We won't go into the largest scale of what motivates families to come here, but they're brought here as children. They've grown up in this country. They clearly identify with the culture here. They identify themselves as Americans. Many of them came as small children, and this is their culture, their country. Many of them don't even speak the language of the countries that they came from. They've never been there. Because of their documentation status, they don't have the opportunity to go back and forth. So even though they might have connections through stories and through conversations with extended families in other countries, they've never been there. This is the only country they know. In addition to that 1.8 million who are undocumented, it's really difficult to even make a prediction about this, but the number of children who are growing up in this country in mixed immigration status families. You might have been the older sibling, but if your younger siblings were born here, they have a totally different set of rights than you have. They're U.S. citizens, and you're not. Someone almost in your extended family network, and in terms of your community, someone in that network is probably undocumented, even if you are a U.S. citizen. So the issues about being documentation for immigrant families is tremendous and huge in this country. I've framed the article really, it's incredibly complex and layered. One of the things I tried to do was do a dialogue between individual stories about who are these students, what are their experiences, what are their lived experiences, what are their day-to-day experiences like, but also bringing in those multi-leveled influences of our institutions, from our schools to the broader dialogue that's happening around immigration to our criminal justice system, because all of those things play out in the lives of these children. So who are these children? Just imagine what it feels like to go to school in the morning and not know if your parents are going to be there when you get home at night. Imagine not being a part of any country. You identify with this country, but in reality, do you have a future here? Do you have a possibility? Your teachers will tell you, if you work hard in school, you can be successful, you can go to college, you can be anything you want to be. But for them, do they really have that possibility? Is that a true sense of hope and possibility, or is that a false sense of hope for them? So they live with those realities day in and day out. Many of those other factors play out in their lives. Certainly poverty that they're subjected to, issues of race, class, gender, language difference, mobility, all of those things. But probably for many of them, the defining characteristics really is their immigration status and that of their family. We're living in a time, there is tremendous anti-immigrant rhetoric. They deal with that every single day. And in terms of our laws and policies, simple things like showing up if a parent is detained and the children end up in a foster care system. If their parents don't show up for their hearings, which the immigration system does not allow them to, children end up in our foster care system permanently and are even adopted out. So the complexity of those interrelationships, not only in individual lives, but in terms of our institutions, is tremendous. I really wrote this paper, though, because I think there's so little understanding of what not only the individual experiences are, but how our policies and practices play out, especially for schools. It's really an issue that in many ways is invisible because families have to keep it silent. Oftentimes even the resources that would be available to other families, they can't access because there's such great fear about identifying anybody in your family who might not have immigration status. So families are really invisible in many, many ways. I definitely talked about the laws and the rights that families have. All the way back to 1978, there's a Supreme Court case, Plyler v. Doe, that gives every child in this country the right to a free, high-quality education regardless of their immigration status. And yet our schools continue to do things inadvertently where they ask for the free and reduced lunch form has a Social Security number asked for it on there. You know, our systems in terms of language services ask about a language history and your history of learning a language. Our school files, our immunization files, all of those records present a challenge for families because it puts them at risk of exposure for sharing those things. You know, Plyler talked about three critical issues: chill, disparity, and exposure. If you think about that chilling effect, think about the rhetoric that we hear in our public every night in terms of the news. Think about the things that children hear about their families and the number of states across the country that have put in anti-immigrant legislation in the last few years. Alabama and Georgia have both put through laws through public initiative that have asked for documentation for families to go to school. That's exactly the case that created Plyler v. Doe in 1978. And yet now, here we are so much later, having states put in the same kind of requirement to show your Social Security number in order to be able to go to school. Those are definitely in our court system. They haven't been implemented, and they will stay in our court system. But the reality is, you know, the outcome may be different now than it would have been years ago. But back to that idea about chill. Immediately, as soon as those laws went on the books, in Alabama, over half the Latino families didn't send their children to school. And that's regardless of immigration status. If you're fearful that your child may be taken, in Arizona, if you're fearful that your child may be taken because they don't have papers, what do? You protect them and keep them home. So that chilling effect of all that public rhetoric and the laws and policies that we're putting in, even to our schools, is incredibly chilling for families. Disparity. How can you treat different students, the same students, differently? How can you ask for a certain kind of documentation or a certain kind of background or certain information? How can you treat them differently? How can you say, this child deserves an education in this family because they were born in this country, but your older sibling came here when they were 2, so that child doesn't get a free, high-quality education? And that sense of exposure, any of us who've worked with immigrant families certainly knows what that is. That makes this factor that dampens everything that they do about the fear that someone might find out about their situation. Even a teacher who's an incredible advocate for you, is it safe to actually talk to that teacher and tell them what your situation is? So those are the 3 issues that we've gone back to for a great long time. They're clearly apparent in so many of the policies and practices we have in schools. If you bring that lens and you're aware of what students and families' experiences are, you can begin to look through those policies and practices in a different kind of way. Obviously, this is something I'm incredibly passionate about. I could talk about for a great long time. But again, I tried to talk about who are these students, what are the laws and practices, and what can really schools do about it. So that piece about the schools is really critical, because what we've been trying to do for 12 years now is pass the DREAM Act. That's the greatest hope for undocumented youth. And youth would be the children who came here and have grown up in this country, so that youth factor can go up to age 35. Every time the DREAM Act has been introduced, it's introduced differently. But essentially the simplest version is if you've been in this country somewhere between 3 and 5 years, you graduate or get a GED from a U.S. public school, go on to college, and you have good moral character, you have a pathway to citizenship. Now, we've been trying for 12 years to pass that, and we haven't been able to do that. Despite initially, in the first 10 years anyway, broad bipartisan support for it with people who come from every perspective along that political spectrum. We still haven't been able to pass that. Last June, President Obama issued an order to the Department of Homeland Security creating the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So the same children that or young people who would have qualified for the DREAM Act, he essentially said, let's set up a process where they can apply for the status. And it doesn't give them legal status in this country. It basically just says, we're not going to deport you. So it's a 2-year process that defers that deportation for 2 years, and it gives students a work permit. So it does indeed create this window of opportunity and this sense of hope for these students. Immediately, students who dropped out of school came back to school as soon as that order was issued. So these things have tremendous immediate impact. If you have the sense that there's a possibility of a future, it changes how you behave in terms of every day. But part of the problem with those particular pathways is you have to be academically successful in order to pursue those pathways. There is another pathway. You can serve in our U.S. military. You still have to graduate from high school and you can serve in our U.S. military. So it's a great way to recruit in times of war. But I think there's some ethical implications of that. But it still means that the DREAM Act or the Deferred Action, you have to be able to graduate from high school. Now, it's hard to get good, accurate educational data with students who are undocumented, but we know already that our Latino dropout rate is about 50% in this country. So if you add those other factors come with students who are undocumented, that's probably even more significantly, probably even higher. So already we're taking of those students who could qualify for the DREAM Act, it still cuts that in half. So they're subjected to all of these things because if that, we don't define what good moral character is, but certainly if you end up in our juvenile justice system or injustice system or prison with the criminalization of immigrants anyway, that's an immediate deportation path. So both those factors, the school-to-prison pipeline and this tremendous opportunity gap that we have for students in our public school system are huge barriers for these students. So one of the things I laid out in the paper is how schools can respond. Certainly the number one thing to do is close the opportunity gap, and that's no simple measure. We've been talking about that forever. But that's a huge factor, is we have to figure out ways it adds an impetus to that. It also, I think, is critical for schools to really understand what are the experiences of students and families, what are the laws and practices, how do they play out in the lives of students and families, how do we look at schools' policies in a way to make sure we're not contributing to those practices, and how can schools be public advocates for their students and families? How can they inform them of their rights and their possibilities for success? How can schools think through the worst case scenario? If you have a raid in your community, which Bellingham was famous for the first raid in the Obama administration, what happens when you have a raid in your community and suddenly in your school you have 30 children who don't have parents at home that night? Or a traffic stop that turns into a deportation situation. How do schools anticipate that? How do they find ways to make sure that all of their children have someone that's going to support them if that worst case scenario happens? And again, then the disparity comes in, right? Because you can't really identify undocumented families only. You have to think about how do you do that in a way that doesn't out your families? How do you make sure that every family has someone who's identified? Those are just some examples. And then, again, back to that most important one is how do we really serve as advocates? How do we really close that opportunity gap? Because if we don't do that for these families, for these students, there's no hope that they have a sense of future here, even though this really is their country. It's their home. It's the only country they've ever known.
Well, thank you, panel. We have a lot of information now out there on the table. And what I'd like to do is try to generate a discussion, give you a chance to voice your thoughts about it, perhaps raise questions with the panel, and feel free to ask anything you want. I'd like to start perhaps with my colleague Kristen, who,
Can we just take a quick wiggle break and just stand up and wiggle for a minute?
okay.
Everybody else feels the need.
Or if anyone wants to pick up, there's quite a few materials over there too.
Evidently having a wiggle break. I teach intermediate, and I know that sitting for more than an hour is hard for anybody, and I suspect more of you want wiggle breaks than your relatives. I appreciate getting mine.
Okay, take a 1 minute wiggle break.
All right, thanks, Lorraine.
Okay. Kristen, you want to start us off perhaps with some question or concern you have, and then I'll open it up to the whole audience?
You know, I keep thinking, thank you all so much. This is, I'm just wrestling with a lot of different questions right now, and I think that so I'm just gonna go with it. One thing that I'm wrestling with is we had a candidate here for our education and social justice position who talked about the sexiness of certain topics, and I think the school-to-prison pipeline is a sexy topic right now. But it's not so sexy for the folks that are affected by it deeply. So the other part of this is, is the statistical information about, prisons being built based on second and third grade reading scores. The kind of the expectation that we'll fill our prisons with young people. And then another issue that I'm wrestling with is schooling in general. So a group of my students watched a film called Schooling the World, which really is pushing this issue, and I'm a U.S. context person as an Indigenous educator. But I look at the indigenousness of all peoples across the world, and I'm concerned with the system of oppression that's being exported to communities that have sustainable educational practices. And so I'm almost in that third part. I'm curious about potentially your positions as you're looking at. We talked a little bit about educational reform, but I'm wondering if we need something beyond educational reform, because we've been working on educational reform, and obviously I think Maria brought up the 50% of Latinos don't graduate from high school because they're being pushed out. I think that the opportunity gap, and I love Gloria Ladson-Billings' perspective that it's really education debt that we owe to communities, because we know African Americans are being pushed out. At least half, more than half of Latinos, and also only 49% of students in the United States graduate from high school. So all, racial and ethnic groups outside of European Americans, and even they're not graduating either at high rates. So we have a system that isn't working for many of our students. How, what, I guess, can we do from your perspectives to really challenge maybe the scholarly sexiness of this topic, the systemic issues that look at children and their failure rates to fill our prisons and not support our schools, and then also this decolonization and our efforts to not colonize other nations through this process. Just some little tiny questions.
Would anyone like to respond?
I'll respond from my perspective as someone who works around issues of language and culture. And I think, it's really telling that of the children who enter our public schools speaking a language other than English, by the time they're in middle school, 80% of them no longer speak their heritage language. To me, that's an indicator of the colonization. If you're asking about schooling the world, what do our schools ask of students in order to be successful? Leave your language, leave your culture at the door. Your families don't participate in schools the way we expect them to, so they obviously don't care. you bring tremendous assets and knowledge and expertise, but we don't necessarily recognize what it is. And I absolutely share the idea that our teachers in schools are really committed people who care deeply about their students. But what is it about our institution that doesn't allow us to see the knowledge that students bring, the assets they bring, the tremendous wealth that we have in terms of that? Instead, we've created a factory model of schooling. And it's interesting to me because the rhetoric now is all about college ready, and I'm always troubled by that because I want every single one of my students to have the opportunity to go on to college and to have that opportunity, because it certainly historically and currently opens all kinds of opportunities in their lives. But what seems to me, it's also creating a different kind of pipeline, because then it becomes the school to work pipeline, right? We're driven by the corporations that are creating the next generation of workers in pretty narrow kinds of ways. It doesn't become about who people are as humans and the incredible wealth of the knowledge and experience and ways of knowing and language and cultures they bring. It becomes a system of trying to sort of mass produce the factory model to create the kinds of workers we need. And that to me is it's a different kind of pipeline, but it's sort of the conveyor belt of schooling.
I'm reminded too of the metaphor that Paulo Freire uses when he talks about our traditional systems of education, and he talks about basically inserting knowledge into the brain banks of students, and how that method and framework in itself, it feels like colonialism to many young people. I know from community organizing that if you're working with somebody and building something with them, there's a mutual investment in that product and in that outcome. And I don't feel like we get enough of that in our education system. When we look at the school-to-prison pipeline at the actual classroom level and are looking at some of the programs that are starting to really change outcomes and eliminate disproportionality, what they're really doing is empowering young people and empowering the adults, teaching social skills, essentially, that we didn't get for whatever reason. And in that process, students and adults are working together to create that classroom culture. And so we have examples like sound discipline, and are people familiar at all with restorative justice? These are frameworks or programs, but in reality, these are opportunities for people to engage in meaningful conversations and actually try to repair relationships. And in doing so, you're building trust and you're moving forward. Another example is a positive behavioral interventions and support system. And what I've learned from researching some of these alternatives is that the way that our discipline system works as a nation, if anyone's heard of Angela Davis, she refers to prisons as this mechanism for which we use as a society to hide all of our social ills, essentially. If we can't address the homelessness issue, we can arrest a lot of homeless people and put them in prison. Suspension works the same in education. If we have adults that aren't able to make headway with this young person, I'm just going to push them out of the classroom because I need to focus on the other 29 students. And so when I've been learning a lot about these alternatives, I'm starting to learn, too, about the way that we view discipline as a nation. And I'm starting to learn more about what a shame-based culture looks like. And for many young people, if they're misbehaving in class or talking out of turn, the way that the teacher regains that authority is by making that young person feel small, or making them feel like an outcast or embarrassed, or any of the above. That's actually a trigger for folks that have grown up experiencing trauma, or that have traumatic things occurring in their life. That sets them off. And if you talk to a young person about it, I was this kid too. If I felt like I was being embarrassed in class, I felt like that adult they're not showing me respect, so why would I show them respect? That person's disrespecting me. That was my trigger. That's like a shame trigger for me. So it's really interesting to look at this issue of school-to-prison pipeline and discipline through this national context of what do we do with criminals as adults? How are we mirroring that behavior with young people? So I don't know if I'm answering questions. I'm raising a lot more. I know that.
I'll just talk a little bit about sort of the sexy topic. So we at the League of Education Voters, when we first started working on this issue, had a number of meetings about what we were going to call the issue.
That's a classic Washington move, by the way. Tough meetings.
Yeah. And I don't know if we ever really came to a decision. Basically, we sort of use different language depending on our audience, to be honest. So we use School-to-Prison Pipeline in this journal article. That's what we're using here today. If we're talking with maybe a more conservative state legislator, we wouldn't use that term because that, in sort of a 5-minute meeting, trying to explain the concept and sort of what we've talked about today is like, you need more than 5 minutes. So we sort of have used the term common sense discipline. It's not nearly, I guess I would say, controversial as the school-to-prison pipeline, again, depending on your audience. But I think people, they sort of got the basic idea, right? Your kids are out of school. That's not really good if we want them to be graduating and going on to college or career. So I think, you can talk about the issue and use different language is what we learned, which was interesting for me because I didn't think sort of using a different name for different audience was going to work really well, but people get what you're talking about. So we sort of made it not nearly as sexy, but it worked, so.
Let's open it up to our group now. What questions, concerns do you folks have that you want to talk about? Chris?
I remember when the first longitudinal data came out about Head Start and the positive influence of keeping students in school through high school graduation, lowering pregnancy rates, and that kind of thing. Are there any data that suggests that Head Start might have a positive influence on keeping students out of the pipeline?
Yeah, so I actually handle early learning for the League of Education Voters also, and what we know is that whether it's Head Start or sort of the similar program we have at the state level, those are sort of whole child programs, and it's interesting to me, which was so fascinating when I first started working on school discipline, was if you come to it with a lens from the early learning world where we view children as sort of, in a way, a blank state, right? They don't know what acceptable behavior is, so it's okay for a 3 or 4-year-old to act out because we're going to teach them acceptable behavior and it's going to be a learning experience. And then you sort of, they get to the K-12 system and they're just sort of expected to know this. So Head Start and those sorts of early education programs have usually a social emotional component where they're learning sort of acceptable behavior and even sort of, right, how to deal with conflict, how to play well with others, all those things. And I haven't actually looked for specific data, but I can imagine that because so many of the suspensions and expulsions are because of behavioral reasons and defiance and sort of not playing well with others, that you would see a link. The research on school discipline is not, I don't know, in some ways I would say it's not as developed as you would think. I was surprised at some of the information and statistics and proof points that I couldn't find. So,
Well, and just to mention, too, that acceptable behavior is a culturally relevant term, ethnically, racially relevant, socioeconomically, gender, all of it. It's all relative, and so again, that comes back to the biases or the core values of the adult in the classroom.
What I think is interesting, I just noticed in the newspaper, the Los Angeles school district has now passed a policy where they are no longer going to expel and suspend students for what they call willful defiance, willful defiance. And, that was a term that could be used in such an arbitrary way. What is, one kid walks out of a classroom without a pass, is that defiance? What is defiance? And a lot of kids get caught up in the juvenile justice system because, for example, school resource officers, police in the schools, fail to understand, adolescent behavior, fail to understand the culture that the kids are coming from, and say, this is disruptive behavior, this is defiant behavior. And suddenly, instead of going to the principal they're being handcuffed and arrested. So I think it's interesting that Los Angeles is finally beginning to see what is going on.
I could just talk briefly too about some other sort of success stories. Not that I don't think any city has sort of a great discipline policy. No one's doing it right perfectly, but Baltimore and Denver changed their school discipline policies and practices quite a while ago. I think they both started in 2008, 2009. And Baltimore has seen their dropout rate go down from, I think it was 7.9% before they changed their policies and practices to 4.2%. And they've seen a direct correlation with their crime, and crime has decreased 80% when you look at sort of juvenile crime. So there are cities that have done it, but it's taken a while, and you don't see the results often overnight. But there are a couple cities across the country. I know Chicago changed their policies. I think this school year was the first year they went into effect, but they had sort of this general rule that for certain behaviors there was an automatic sort of 10-day suspension, that was considered standard, and they really drastically cut the number of days to 3 to 5 depending on sort of what the behavior was. But I think schools and certain school leaders are starting to get it more in the last couple years than they did before, but we still have a long way to go.
I think also a really important thing to think about is that our schools blame the individual, right? It's a problem with the child. So if there's something going on in the classroom, I want teachers to stop and say, why is this child behaving in this way? It could be something that's going on at home. It could be something absolutely not connected to what's happening in the classroom at all. I mean, did their parent get picked up the night before? Did their parent have a fight? Did something happen on the way to school? Or were they being bullied on the playground? There are all kinds of things that might be going on well beyond what's happening in that classroom. But we don't stop to ask. We don't start with that position like Head Start starts with, who is this child and how do I help them be successful? We stop and immediately say, that's a bad kid. Kids don't bring homework to school with them. And we immediately say, well, they're not unmotivated. They just don't care. Instead of saying, oh, they're going home and taking care of their younger brothers and sisters because they have to make a contribution to the family. So, I think one of the things is instead of blaming the child and immediately assuming the most negative, how do we say, what's the context that's happening here? And then what does that child need to make it different? Or, quite honestly, back to that idea of willful defiance, quite honestly, sometimes when our young people are in schools and situations where they experience racism every day, it's probably a sign of resilience that they stand up and say, I will not be treated that way. They may not have the language to identify exactly what's happening. They may not have the language or ability to say it in those kinds of ways. But oftentimes what they're responding to with that resistance is the oppressions that they're dealing with day in and day out and the messages they get about who they and their families are. So I guess as a teacher educator, I think if we can just stop and interrupt and say, I believe that this person wants to do the very best thing. How do I understand their situation? And how do I support them to do something differently? I think if we all treated all of our students like early childhood educators, I think many of these issues would go away.
From a teacher's perspective, I think, you've hit on lots of, important pieces. I've talked to new teachers and been in, school to be a teacher myself, and I know there are a lot of obstacles standing between what you're talking about and what happens in classroom practice for a number of reasons, particularly because you're talking mostly about high school, middle school and high school in particular. And teachers need time to get to know kids, and they need time to ask questions. And I was privileged to work in an independent school here in town where I had the freedom to devote time to class meetings, to nurturing who the children were, teaching the other kids how to support each other, Yeah, and we had multiple age classrooms, so I'd have the same child for more than 1 year, and we had smaller classrooms and so on. But I know that when teachers come out of teaching college, the biggest fear a teacher has is having somebody in their classroom out of control. If you're not in control of your classroom, the principal walks in, a parent walks in, a colleague walks in, anybody walks in, I mean, the worst thing in the world is for them to see that you don't have control of your classroom. I mean, even as an experienced teacher, I get cold chills. It's like, ah. And for young teachers, that's especially. So they tend to resort to positions of authority as ways to get control, rather than a place of compassion and empathy and taking the time to kind of figure that out in other ways. So part of one question I come with is, what are we doing in teaching colleges, if you will, to teach new teachers the skills they need to do that. And it's very difficult because they're young. Most of them haven't figured that out for themselves. I mean, how are they going to walk into a 13 or 14-year-old that's challenging them? Most of them aren't parents. They haven't raised teenage, they don't have the world perspective, so they need mentoring. But more than that, they need time. I mean, with the factory, you can't have 6 classrooms of 30 kids a day and have the time to really understand what's going on with them. So this idea of it's not just about reform, it's about fundamentally changing how we see the purpose of school and the relationships that adults have with children at school. I was on this forum last year, the year before, but one of the things I've learned as teaching is that it's all about relationship, relationship, and relationship. Real estate is about location, location, location. Kids can't learn if they don't trust you and you don't know who they are. But I don't think public school teachers today have the time to do that, and they don't have the skills to do it.
And I think you've just framed the issue really well, because it's not about individuals. I mean, we can do better and I do believe that teachers have an incredible power to make a difference in their students' lives. But they're within an institutional context. That's the policies and practices, right? Because you're right. I mean, if you have a relationship with a student, if you have the ability to control your curriculum and design it in a way that really is empowering to your students, that connects to their experiences, that gives them the opportunities for success, I mean, you're going to have tremendous, even as an individual teacher, that's going to create a different kind of culture in your classroom. It's going to engage your students in a different kind of way. But those factors don't happen. We're getting more and more scripted curriculum that's mandated and tied to accountability. We have factory schools where teachers see 250 kids in a day. How do you possibly build a relationship with 250 kids? And that changes every semester. So you're right there. I mean, there's all those layers and layers of institutional policies and practices. So even as an individual, if I'm the most powerful teacher in the world, I still can't really change the outcome for students unless we do it systemically.
The most important thing is to help them be humans.
I think Chris has a response to you.
Yeah, it just breaks my heart.
Forgive me for forgetting. I've read all the articles, but I forget sometimes where the ideas all come from. But one of the articles in this issue addressed Lincoln High School in Walla Walla. Is a place, was that yours?
Yeah.
Where they were doing very much like what Maria and Val have been suggesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways I think that as individuals and as community, as family members, we can make a difference. And there's, we shouldn't be paralyzed by those many ways. I mean, just taking one step will make a difference. And I think, our perspective as lawyers, we feel like, there's an opportunity for rights-based advocacy for many children, and there's not enough resources to go around to make sure that they have a fighting chance at kind of getting out of this sort of current that's leading in the wrong direction. But I think our office is increasingly trying to think about how we can be, as lawyers, a catalyst for community-driven solutions. There's so much about the way our laws are developed and our institutions are set that people take for granted and don't question. We have been talking about disproportionality in the juvenile justice system for 30-some years and have seen the exact same. I'm really interested in reading your article and understanding the sort of notion of, things stay the same, and we may be trying to pull the wrong levers to get them to change. Maybe that's not the point of your article, but I feel like, we have to make a drastic shift in how our institutions are structured. And, whether you start with the educational system or you close the doors of a juvenile justice facility and say, we're not going to lock up kids anymore, period. Because that, we know, doesn't do them any good. And in fact, it probably doesn't keep our community safer. And it may keep it safer for 30 days or 90 days or until they're 18, but it's certainly not going to keep our community safer forever. And we need to think about ways and strategies that will, I mean, I guess I'm, the activist in me is coming out here that as a lawyer and as a law office and as a, as sort of, the bearer of witness to some of the extreme injustices that our young people and families are facing, that, one thing that we can do as an organization is be this catalyst for community-driven solutions. That you all have to care, and your neighbors have to care, and the people that don't believe in this issue have to care enough to be able to make the institution change. And I don't think any one person can do it alone. I think we just need to commit collectively to do it. I don't know how to do that. I'm not I'm not as good of an organizer as Maggie, but I feel like I don't want to be around 20 years from now talking about the same problem. And if I am, then I might actually be part of the problem. So I want to step out of the way and let some of these new ideas come in and have the young people that hopefully can see, outside of this sort of frame that we've created and we work in every day, to see that things could be done differently.
And
Can I have a quick comment?
Yeah.
I'm listening to you. You mentioned the word time. Let's say 12 times, and I got really interested. And all right, and then you moved it over to things that I would not like. I want to come back to the fact you nailed it. I think you called it pressure points. A colleague of mine some years ago did his doctoral dissertation from Stanford with somebody else, and Elizabeth Cohen, you might know her work. And they drew a distinction between unidimensional classrooms and multidimensional classrooms. Multidimensional is an expanded curriculum, such as auto mechanics, jazz, and so forth. That gave black and Hispanic and minority students, if you will, bargaining chips. And the second criterion was time. Take your time, work on this, bring it in, hand it in when you want. The racial disparities were basically eliminated in 2.5 months. So we know what to do. And one of the key factors is time. Now, to be the Durkheimian quickly, Beard, is that they got a large grant from Nashville, Tennessee school system to employ what they're called the theory, ability formation theory. And it was working in a very racially disparate, divided city. Enter parents. They squashed it. So it's not the schools so much, or at all. It's that you tamper with tracking structures, and in the next couple of days, parents will be en masse at the front door demanding that they be reinstituted. So time is a political variable. That's all I'm saying.
And I guess I'd like to just go back to the idea about organizing for change, because I think it's really critical right now. There's also huge money behind all these issues. If we talk about the school-to-prison pipeline, there's huge money in our prisons. And one of the reasons we have the number of deportations we have right now is because as the prison rate has dropped, we have all these private prisons that need to fill their beds and make the money. So we've increased the deportation rate tremendously. So that's a huge money factor. The testing industry is a huge money factor. And if you talk about, making policy changes and law changes, I mean, the cycle for our politicians in terms of trying to get reelected, there's huge money behind it, huge corporations behind all these issues. And then I think the only way we'll ever really change that is if we really have a people's movement, that we all start caring more about what to do and taking a larger role in terms of what happens in our schools, in our communities, and push back to ask our politicians to represent us and not the corporations. Because there's huge money behind all these issues.
And along those lines, when I talked about the feeder system, when you begin to research and look at the corporations that have a stake in the criminal justice system, it's mind-boggling when you look at the low to no wage free labor that is going on in prisons. And in our state, some of our biggest corporations are benefactors of that prison labor. At the University of Puget Sound, we did a Chisholm series, and one of the series dealt with that whole prison scene. And so anywhere from Microsoft to Boeing to Nordstrom to Amazon, very cheap wages are paid to these prisoners. When you think about just the beds, the sheets, the food industry, the uniforms, the prison guards, it is truly a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. And so there are more interest in keeping these prisons full than there is in decreasing the population. So who's the raw material? Students. If we can stop that prison pipeline and stop that flow of students from our schools into the criminal justice system, it terribly upsets. It terribly upsets that adult criminal justice system, and to an awful lot of people, they want no part of it. That's a hard pill to swallow, but it's the reality of what we're dealing with. When we look at data that says in America, we incarcerate more people than any other free country in this world. In this world. Communist countries, you name it. We incarcerate more people than
Also,
any
more
other
people as a percentage of the population.
in the world. And that hasn't caught enough people's attention to really get serious about analyzing what's going on and stop it.
I feel like we spent a lot of time already talking about structures and institutions, but I also too just want to acknowledge that personal bias and prejudice in the classroom is still very real. And I know I'm saying this in a college of education, and the reason I know that it's real is because when I talk about it in Seattle, when I talk about it in Washington, people get defensive very quickly, which means that we have some discomfort around this issue of race and racism. And so I don't want to excuse any of the individual players that are making up these schools and these institutions, because we all have agency in this. And one example that I can share, I was working with a teacher, a white male in his 50s, who I didn't feel like respected his students. He got along with them fine. He was younger and hip, and used language that resonated with them. But when they were all gone out of the classroom, he's teaching in an alternative high school where 100% of the kids have been suspended or expelled. All students of color, probably 90% low income, free and reduced lunch. When they're all out of the classroom, he says, "You don't know what you're getting into. These are bad kids. These kids have done some things." And he's talking about how they live in the ghetto, and they're hood rats. This is racially coded language, and if I were to confront him and say, "I think that's racist," he doesn't feel that that's racist. He didn't maybe he's not making the connection that these are racial biases that he's applying. But when he's talking about the ghetto and the hood, he's really talking about young black males. And so we don't have these conversations candidly here in Seattle or in Washington. I feel like it's a regional issue that we're facing. And any of us that have spent time in other cities, these are topics that we talk about regularly. And I think that's one of the major roadblocks that we face at trying to change a public school system that's not acknowledging our racial biases.
I know we're a little on time, but I actually have a question for Dr. Jackson. And I have to say that I'm a huge Dr. Jackson fan. And although you're too young to be an elder, you have the wisdom to be an elder, in my perspective.
I am a fully vested elder.
Thank you.
Included.
So you said something that really struck me. You talked about tinkering around the edges, and that we need to think fundamentally differently. And I've been following a lot of indigenous movements, and I recently went to a language immersion school in Leech Lake, Minnesota, which was amazing, and they're doing something fundamentally differently. And so indigenous scholars are talking about not recentering, we're talking about choosing the margins. they're choosing the margins. So I would love to know from your work with the minority, with the METT, and all the work that you've done in Washington, and your experiences in classrooms and your advocacy work and agency, what would you like to see us do differently in those edges?
Well, you touched upon it a little bit. We really need to erase the edges. It's like coloring outside the box. And, taking a look at who are the students in our schools today. They aren't the students for which the system was designed. But we are trying to force assimilation, the factory model. Got to think the same, look the same, act the same, and none of that is true. And so if we can rethink our pedagogy, what we teach, how we teach it, how we must make sure that it's culturally inclusive, make sure that culturally relevant, and all of these kinds of things, because the system is so predicated upon a Western European model. And until that changes somewhat, you have an absence of people of color in the system significantly. In the elementary or in the K-12 system, you still predominantly have white females teaching kids of color. So how can we fundamentally change how we do what we do? How can we make education more relevant? How can we listen to the voices of youth? They certainly have some answers for us if we would only listen. I was on my drive up here today from Olympia. There was a commentary on the news radio talking about we've gone more and more and more to early dismissal, late start, and the instructional day is getting shorter, shorter, shorter. And it's a mechanism of negotiation. Since the money is short and can't pay more money, here is how we will shorten the school day. And talking about the learning impact on kids when the picture is already, very, very bad. So within this box of this 180-day school year, this 6-hour day, Carnegie units, so forth and so on, we're trying to pound the square peg into a round hole. And at the same time, we have the rhetoric of we want our students to exit our schools career and college ready. That's another romantic term these days, without an analysis of what that means exactly. But at the same time, we have the kind of system where a Bill Gates would not be allowed in our schools to teach a course in programming because he doesn't have a certificate. I do guest lectures quite often in the high schools, but I don't have a teacher certificate, so no matter how many students might say, I learned more about biology in the last hour than I have all year. The system is not allowing the connection between who needs to be teaching kids and who's not. And then the part about the colleges and how they're training the teachers and the administrators coming out. There's a disconnect there. Here's the real world and here's school. And the students are just so intuitive and so bright today that also is contributing to the dropouts. I'm out of here. I see no relevance to this. Why am I being made to take all these irrelevant courses, and what I really want to spend my time doing is over here? The system does not allow that. And so we've got to, sometimes depending on the setting I'm in, I say blow it all up and start rebuilding again, because as long as we tinker, propping it up, adding wings, adding elements to it, where the foundation of education has so crumbled. And like any structure, you got to rebuild that foundation and then go up and go out. But we're going up and out on this crumbling foundation. And so the data is indicating more and more that the system has become outdated, obsolete, and no longer serving the purpose it was originally designed for. And that takes a lot of courage and a lot of will on the part of policymakers on this discipline issue. We can identify a couple of schools and a district that just said, no more suspensions. We aren't suspending or kicking out any more kids. Didn't take a policy change, didn't take a congressional act. It just took the will of a principal looking at the data saying, how can kids learn if they aren't in school? We're going to behavior modification kinds of programs. We're going to PBIS. We're going to restorative justice. We're going to some different things, but we aren't giving them the privilege of being on the streets. They are going to be here learning. How can that become infectious? How can that become, the way to go? But it's a complete rethinking of the structures we have. And believe it or not, none of us said this up here today, but all of this discipline is in the name of safety. Mm-hmm. We got to have a safe learning environment, a safe working environment. It's in the name of safety. But the outcome is definitely not there. So we're talking about a school system that is multicultural, multiracial, multilinguistic, and a bunch of other multis. Not uniformly anything anymore. But we're trying to uniformly apply an instructional process. We do not recognize the various worldviews, the various points of view, the various experiences. We don't accept kids where they are. They aren't going to be where we wish they were, but we have to accept them where they are. So what does that mean for the curriculum? What does that mean for the changes we have to make in our instructional process and the resistance and the energy that goes into maintaining the status quo? But all we hear about is we need more money, more money, more money. Yes, we need more money. Yes, we need more resources. But it is not the silver bullet that Maggie was talking about. More money without some fundamental change and some reform will not change the outcomes of what we've been seeing in the last 20, 30 years. And so the conversation that needs to happen, the leadership that's needed from the education community on this, there's a huge void. So it's the outside groups, it's the advocacy groups, it's the community groups, it's the business community, it's the legislature. These are the folk. The change we do see, that's where it's being led from, not from the educators and the professionals who purport to be the experts. Well, it's time for the experts to step forward and say, we know what we need to do. We know how we need to teach. We know what works for kids. And we are proposing this new system of education. I mean, you have a community that might even be talking about year-round school or extended school year. The community comes unglued. A simple thing like change the time you start school. Oh, we can't do that. It disrupts the bus schedule. I mean, the stuff that we allow to get in the way of good common sense thinking. So that's what I mean by tinkering around the edge. Yeah, we'll make this change as long as it doesn't mess up the lunch hour, as long as it doesn't mess with the bus schedule, as long as it doesn't impact the negotiated contract, as long. What are you left with that you can change or alter? Literally nothing but a few little tinkers around the edge, which make no difference given the seriousness of the problems that our society and our communities and our schools are facing. So that's kind of where my head is. Okay.
Well, we are out of time, and I'd like to once again thank our panel, and thank all of you for coming, and hopefully we gave you a few things to think about. And, thanks again.
Before we